following message is transmitted.
This episode of the Order of Chaos podcast is brought to you by the Mystic Raven, owned and operated by one of our very own graduates. The Mystic Raven is your one-stop shop for all your occult and ritual needs. It's where I buy everything for my practice. My favorite item that I've purchased is this journal, which is where I do all my sigil work. The Mystic Raven stocks thousands of items, everything you need from candles to journals to ritual supplies from various practices. It is a very, very well-stocked store owned and operated by an actual practicing, which I really can't recommend it enough. And for those of you who join the Order of Chaos Mystery School, you get 10% off. So once again, this episode is brought to you by the Mystic Raven. Links to the Mystic Raven will be in the description, and check it out. It's an amazing store. It's got everything you need. I really can't recommend it enough. All right, welcome back to the Order of Chaos podcast, where we discuss modern occult and spiritual topics, as well as all things paranormal and supernatural. A few quick announcements before we get started. If you would like to learn all about modern magic and witchcraft and become an adept at the magical arts yourself, consider joining us at the Order of Chaos Mystery School Living Witchcraft program. Living Witchcraft is a month-long intensive course on the art and science of magic and witchcraft, designed to give you all the tools and knowledge you need for a successful practice. Links to the Living Witchcraft program will be in the description. Tonight, my guest is David Shoemaker. David is a clinical psychologist specializing in Jungian and cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, as well as the chancellor and prolocutor of the Temple of the Silver Star and host of the Living Thelema podcast. In tonight's episode, we will be discussing David's new book, The Way of the Will, which is available now from Wiser Books. Links in the description. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Yeah, this is awesome. I really, really enjoyed our last conversation. I'm excited to do this. This is your new book. It is fantastic. I have not had the chance to finish it yet, but I perused through it and read a few chapters that I thought were particularly interesting. I love the way you write, and I love that you take Crowley, which can be very hard to understand, and make it very easy to understand. And I think that you're doing a real service to the magical community by doing this because, for me, it's very hard to decipher Aleister Crowley. I know that there's a lot of wisdom in there, and I know that there's a tremendous amount of useful information, but because I didn't grow up in any kind of a religious home, so much of the symbolism doesn't make sense to me. So much of it seems like it's just out of my wheelhouse, especially as a chaos magician. So I really appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thanks for saying so. Yeah, it is tricky with Crowley because he's obviously brilliant, but in terms of packaging for accessibility, that was not his strong suit. So what I try to do is not dumb things down, because I think the material will be as smart as the person working it.
Mm-hmm.
What I do try to do, however, is make it accessible by talking about it in everyday terms, in terms of like, how might you approach a certain practice, or trying to limit the jargon if it's not helping.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need, like the Kabbalistic psychology section of the book, you need those terms to really get all the nuances that are built into that system. But in other places, I think what Crowley tends to do is go so deep so quickly into symbolism and allegory and cultural references of the time that are less obvious now for us modern readers, and assuming too much knowledge on the part of the reader, so it's hard to dig into in the same way. So I try to cut to the chase, I guess.
Yeah. Now, concerning that, how did you personally come to understand all that symbolism yourself?
Just long study. I had the advantage pretty early in my exposure to Thelema, like within 6 months of discovering it. I joined the larger tradition that Temple of the Silver Star comes out of, and I joined the Ordo Templi Orientis and AA. So I had good guidance early on, and I was able to live the symbols, like working in a Tree of Life based Golden Dawn, Thelemic Golden Dawn order. and tradition, you're not just memorizing Hebrew letters. You're doing tasks associated with the paths on the tree and integrating those experiences into your knowledge of yourself and the knowledge of what the symbols even mean. So I always think that's the best way to kind of grapple with a complex system is live it one step at a time until it's kind of obvious. Oh, of course it works this way because I experienced that thing a year ago, and that makes sense. Kind of putting it into context.
Absolutely. Personally, I experienced very much the same thing through tarot and through the teachings of the Qabalah, which are very important to me, and also chaos magic. Right. Mm-hmm. So similarly, when I discovered chaos magic, now I've been practicing various forms of metaphysics for 15 years before I discovered chaos magic. But when I did, I was locked in. It sounds like you were locked into Thelema from the very beginning.
Pretty much. Yeah. I had a brief, of course, as people may know, just from past interviews, I came to magic through my Jungian studies, and then found Rigardi and then found Crowley. There was a brief period there where it was more general exploration of neo-paganism and just where the, read Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon and stuff like that, is sort of seminal works on what's the state of modern paganism. And that was a, useful foundation for sure. But then once I found Crowley and Thelema and the ways that could interface with my psychology work, I was kind of sold.
Yeah. So I think you had a real advantage in that you discovered Carl Jung and then metaphysics, right? In that order. Mm-hmm. And most people go the other way, right? They discover metaphysics, or they get very interested in magic, and then they discover Carl Jung's work and they get very interested, but it's like, this is heavy. If you were going to try and read the Red Book, for example, it's maybe not as confusing as Crowley, but it's certainly not straightforward either. So having that understanding and then going into your magical practice probably gave you a real kind of insight into what was going on there with the Tree of Life.
Yeah, I would say so, because I had already rooted my Jungian studies. Jungian studies are pretty esoteric in their own way, and touch on so many aspects of comparative religion and symbol systems and things like that, that once you kind of are grounded in the archetypes and the way all that kind of stuff works, and you have a mental model for how this relates to the human psyche, then kind of superimposing that on the Tree of Life and understanding it in that light, and some of the other nuances of Crowley's work, it worked for me anyway. I'm not going to say that that's the best way to do it, but it certainly helped me get a foothold.
Yeah. So regarding that, the Kabbalistic psychology, I know that you said that this was something that was, you really dug into for this book. Can you tell us what that is? And then I want to reiterate something that was said to me in a comment on, I think, our last episode. Somebody had this big comment about how, Jung's been debunked. That's a bunch of nonsense, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Right. Which is, so I just want to get your take on that. Because, going back to Jung, who I believe was a student of Freud, right? Do you feel that these older models are better? Are they worse? Are they comparable? Are they what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think we're in an era of living systems of psychology, constantly building and developing and evolving, and you don't throw out the bricks in a wall because you put new bricks on top. Otherwise you don't have a wall anymore. So I don't think it's a question of overturning older things just because they're older. I also think depending on which research you're looking at and which frame of reference you're looking through in terms of what means that a system is valid, what kind of proof do you look to, what kind of experience in yourself, and in my case in your clients or students, seems to validate that a system has merit. And my answer to that is pretty pragmatic, which is watching people benefit, including myself, from a way of looking at things. And it doesn't have to be framed as this is the truth, or because research on cognitive behavioral psychology shows that perhaps it's more efficient to work on depression in the first 10 weeks using CBT rather than Jungian work or something. That doesn't mean that the whole of Jung's system of thought is to be tossed out. So just speaking of that specific question of Jung being debunked. So with Kabbalistic psychology, what we're talking about is an ancient system of understanding the interplay between what the Kabbalists call the parts of the soul, which briefly correspond to the body, the mind, the unconscious mind, the conscious mind, and the superconscious, the spiritual aspect of human existence. And so it is a model which is inherently transpersonal, meaning it's a way of understanding humans that has a built-in reference to the divine as being integrated in human experience and in consciousness. So you don't have to superimpose that on this system, which makes it pretty fascinating from a therapeutic point of view and from my magical worldview to have a system of psychology that already has the tree of life built into it and already has some very nuanced ways of understanding the interplay of the parts of a person and their relationship to the divine. So in the book, there's a multi-part section on this that covers the different parts of the soul individually and then kind of integrates it. But the particular frame around it in this book anyway is, what does this mean in the new aeon, that is in the Thelemic aeon of humanity? How is it different? How are our goals as evolving human beings different than they might have been 500 or 1,000 years ago? What's the wave of evolution that we're on the crest of here? And how can we make the most of that? How can we understand ourselves in light of that differently than we might have an aeon ago? So to me, it was very important for me personally to kind of get that in writing. I did some podcast episodes on that. As with everything in the book, it's very fleshed out from what the podcast episodes were, when there has been a podcast episode, and trying to really speak to the totality of my view of Kabbalistic psychology for the first time in print. So that's why it's so important to me.
Yeah. And then that's, so, you talk about the great work, which is this transformation that you go through, right? And that's the aspect of living through it, but then getting it down on paper, man, that feels really, really good, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I found that at least that in this era of my writing life, that it has been helpful to get a podcast episode recorded first to get my ideas out and outlined, and then later kind of come back to that and say, now how will I flesh this out into a chapter and add things I need to. But that's sort of the ultimate satisfaction, though, to finally get through that whole process of outlining, talking about it conversationally on the podcast, but then like, all right, here it is in black and white,
Very, very cool. I'm on the verge of that myself.
Right.
I spent many years developing my practice, and now I've launched my new program, which I'm very, very proud of. It's been going strong for 4 months. And I recently submitted an essay along with a number of other chaos magicians for a project that Peter Carroll is involved in. And that's going to be my first bit of published work. So it just feels so good just to get it. Like, you have an idea, you spend many years formulating it, and you get it on paper in a way that it might make sense to another human being. I'm not a writer, so to me it was like, whew, wow. And this is just, it's just a couple of pages, but what you've done here is really incredible, and the system really seems to work, right? It doesn't contradict itself, which is something I think a lot of people struggle with when they're learning a magical practice, and they find that it tends to conflict with what they know about reality via experience if they've never studied any of this kind of thing. So again, I think you're doing a real service to anybody who reads this book, because you're putting it together from the point of a clinical psychologist, which is of course very, very valuable, because it gives you tremendous weight to your words, right? I mean, as opposed to maybe someone who's just an occultist, which is wonderful too, but there's some trust people can place in you.
I suppose that's true. I think kind of functionally, one of the things that being a therapist brings to this kind of work is that all day, every day, what I'm doing in my therapy work is helping people kind of grow right into whatever their next frontier is. Like they're in a stuck place somehow, or they're wrestling with an inner issue that they don't quite understand or don't quite know what to do with. And so that's not very different from what I do when I'm teaching. magic or writing about magic. It's like, how would I get somebody just to cross the bridge of, not understanding this concept to understanding this concept? And that threshold is very interesting to me. That's where we grow. It's a growing edge.
Yeah. And do you find that the people are geared towards one or the other, or is it just about the way it's presented? In
One or the
terms
other,
of,
meaning psychology or magic, or
well, the more esoteric approach versus the more exoteric approach, I'd say, or the modern approach versus the ancient approach.
in my particular work, I see them both as modern,
Mm-hmm.
because it's happening now.
Yeah, for sure.
But I get what you're saying. I think it's very case by case. Some people are drawn to immediately and vibrantly to traditional practices, so their mindset is more like, give me the grimoire, or give me the magical ritual, and others may be more into this self-help sort of side to it, or the psychological self-awareness part of it. But in the Temple of Silver Star, most particularly, we've integrated those both together very tightly at each stage of the process. So it's never only about magic, or only about psychology, or only about any other topic, astrology, tarot, whatever.
Yeah. You know what? Honestly, and I just thought of this because I've been watching a tremendous amount of material lately on, I just got addicted to a YouTube channel. I'll give a shout out. It's called Let the Fresh Air In. And she talks about cults, right? And within that niche of self-help, that convergence of self-help and mysticism are a great many charlatans.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna name names right now, but I mean there are a lot of people out there giving bad advice who don't have the credentials that you have, and their information is coming from their own channeling experiences. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of narcissism and ego maybe at play there that they're unaware of. And these people seem to maybe not even realize that they've started a cult. And it's scary. So, I mean, not just another reason why it's great to have people with the education and the credentials putting these things together, because I personally feel like there is a real opportunity in combining these things and combining the mysticism with the more clinical aspect of it, in terms of giving people something that fits just right. That's, I'm going to compare it to food. It's like, it's not a cheeseburger and it's not a salad. There's something in there in the middle where it's like, okay, this is good and it's good for me and it's digestible and I can do it.
Yeah. I like that image. There's screens on the cheeseburger.
Yeah.
I think one thing I didn't even think to clarify this until you were talking about the danger of cult thinking, I guess, just in case there's any misunderstanding. I don't, if someone's in a magical group that I'm running, I don't take them on then as a therapy client. So I always keep those things separate. Have heard worries about this in the aether, and so I wanted to clarify that. And if I were working with a client and they were interested in joining a group that I'm in because they knew about my work or something, we would need to stop the therapeutic relationship. And
so what you're saying right now, that's the thing that these other people, maybe they don't realize that it's inappropriate to do both of those things at the same time. And so they're like, we'll do all that, we'll just fix everything for you and just give us all your money,
Right.
So,
right. And the money's a whole other thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, David, you talk in your book in part 2 about some advanced practices. So I'm really intrigued. What advanced practices are you talking about, and what, can you give us a bit of a description?
So the idea I had with this is that there are a number of Crowley's instructional levers, as they're called, that just don't get talked about as much. Everybody talks about Liber O with all the basic magical rituals, and Liber E with all the basic yoga stuff. Other things that are fairly commonly used in practice, like Liber Resh for the solar adorations each day, things like that. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that Crowley wrote that is really very useful information and practically useful to do. And I wanted to speak to that a little bit. So I'm thinking of things, and this is what's in the book, things like Liber Yod, which is a set of practices for drawing everything in the mind to a single point, which is done at a certain phase of the AA work, where the aspirant is attempting to kind of integrate, synthesize, and focus everything they've learned in order to bring about the right state of mind for the knowledge and conversation working with the Holy Guardian Angel. Another one I focus on is Liber Thisharv, which is Crowley's writings about developing what he calls the magical memory, but also it relates to past lives and doing work to recall past lives, whatever one believes those to be, whether that's a psychological exercise or whether that's an actuality of past lives. I leave that to each person to decide for themselves. Yeah, Liber Turis, which is a really fascinating advanced concentration practice where not only are you trying to, you've moved past doing a meditation where you're focusing on like a magical, a sigil of some kind, or focusing on the breath or something like that. In Liber Turis, it's practices for actually destroying thought. One of the core aspects of it is formulating destructive force outside of yourself somewhere. And every time, like a thing that's going to just send down a lightning bolt and blast something out of existence, and every time you recognize a thought coming, it blasts it.
That is
so
hilarious to me because I do that.
Yeah.
But I imagine little laser guns shooting my thoughts away.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And so things like that, just practices just haven't got as much mileage and discussion. Also in that section, talking about how to maximize the effectiveness of your magical invocations, how to sort of compose those and make them efficient. I have a chapter on the Gnostic Mass of Order Templi Orientis, looking at that in two parts. One part is what sort of lessons in magical technology are evident from Crowley's Gnostic Mass. And then part two is how do you make the most out of participating in it as an attendee from the morning and when you get up to go to the Mass that day. Where's your head at in terms of approaching it as a magical ritual that you're going to actually make an effectual change in yourself? So I had fun with that one.
One of the reasons I enjoy having you on this show is, I get to talk for a moment with a clinical psychologist, and I think that's really cool because it's not all my guests are. So pardon me if I have a few questions that aren't directly related to the book, but I'd love to ask you anyway. I am a person who's diagnosed with pretty severe ADHD, and my course and the things that I do are kind of geared towards people like me. One thing that I find is that many of my students, and myself included, struggle with, with really, really silencing that inner dialogue. Now, I've gotten pretty good at it over, several years, but for some of my students, they're saying this is impossible. I don't. The advice that I've been giving them, which comes from a book called The Monkey is the Messenger, is that if you can't silence the inner dialogue, just let it run wild. Just let it off the leash and let it go and see what it brings back to you. But I want to know what you thought of that, if you think this is a worthwhile exercise, or if you have any other advice for people with ADHD who are trying to get into that meditative, magical consciousness.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot there. First of all, it's important to recognize there are different styles of meditation, different approaches to it, and some of which may be easier than others. Some definitely are easier than others, but also depending on one's personal makeup. And someone with ADHD, I'm not an ADHD specialist or anything, but someone with ADHD may have an easier time with certain things than others. Just like some people may have an easier time with breathing meditations, breath awareness, more so than focus on a visual image. One thing is just to experiment with different approaches for anyone and find what works best for you. That said, this is trainable stuff. If we couldn't train people to be better meditators in general, we wouldn't be bothering to do any of this, in terms of working with meditation in these training schools. I would say to someone, regardless of whether they have an ADHD diagnosis or not, don't assume that you can't get better and stronger at something. Now, part three of what I want to say about that is that everyone has inherent strengths and weaknesses, and something may never be our magical strength, but that doesn't have to stop us from progress. Some people are really just never going to get very good at doing ritual, like in group. And that doesn't mean they can't attain. Some people are never going to be very good at meditating. Some people are never going to be very good at visualization, like drawing a pentagram and sort of
that's me
seeing it.
Yeah, visualization is definitely my weakest area, but I haven't let it hold me back. It's something I just continue to work on.
So just like anything else in life, you make the most of things you're not so great at, and you really, forge ahead with the things that are natural strengths. And just Temple of Silver Star and AA at least are set up this way. You're going to have to at least try things that are not strengths for you in order to build balance in your practice and in your self-awareness and in just your arsenal of tools. So don't be afraid to try things that you're going to suck at first, and maybe will continue to suck at, but still need to be tried and explored.
So one area of your book that I really, really enjoyed was at the end, you talk about your own experience with your, knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel and how you went about that process. And I think it was interesting, first of all, that you had this kind of synchronicity of tragedy happening in your life, which immediately, as I'm reading it, the death card from the tarot immediately just jumps into my mind. You're about to go through this transformation, and then it's manifest in the exterior as well. What I found interesting also was that you did not go through the Abramelin ritual exactly as so many people believe you must do it exactly this way, or it's completely invalid and doesn't work. Yep. So I like that you addressed that. So, can we just hear a little about that from your own words, how that went? And
sure. Well, yeah, to the first point, there was definitely a time in my life when everything seemed to be kind of falling apart. Marriage ending, my father died, or was dying, my teacher died, Phyllis Seckler. And so the consciousness I was in was sort of like, I was being forced to face certain attachments, to relationships or people, zones of comfort, And so when you don't have those things anymore, the natural question is, where do I look to next? What do I do? Who am I if these things are gone? And those were kind of the wake up calls that were telling me, and I was at that place in the AA system anyway, of being sort of on the cusp of doing the KNC working, that this was confirmation. Okay, now is the time. It's now or not now or never, but now's the time. So I just dove in, and as I said in the book, I think I didn't know what was going to happen in all those mundane circumstances, but at that moment, one of the few sources of comfort I had was that the me that was going to pop out on the other side of the working would probably have a better idea of what to do. Yeah. So we'll throw it to that guy, kick the can down the road a little bit on the mundane side, and just focus on the magical for now. So I did a sort of a hybridized working of Crowley's Liber Samekh, which is a beautiful ritual of designed to bring the knowledge of conversation, and I hybridized that with some of the material in his Liber 8, which is extracted from his Enochian work with the 8th Aether, and kind of made a synthesized, customized set of workings which spanned 11 weeks and culminated in a 1 week, really more like 10 days, solitary and focused retirement. Came to the climax of that working, and as I've often said to people in recent talks, everything anyone's ever heard about that I've done has happened because that breakthrough happened and opened up zones of awareness that I didn't know they existed before. And the material that started coming through at that point, I could never have experienced as just ideas that I had. It was on a whole other level of character. Where did this come from? It feels like it's handed to you rather than you're thinking of it per se, and became obviously a tremendous turning point in my life. And that was 2004. And hard to believe it'll be 20 years this December. Don't know what my life would look like if I hadn't done it.
Yeah. Now, and you said it's been 20 years. So one of the things I really liked that you talked about in your book was that this isn't a one-time thing that happens, right? This is a progression. You're building up to it. There's the knowledge and conversation, and then what comes next? What's afterward? How does that relationship progress?
Well, the first step, really writ large, is all right. I've got this new awareness of my true will, my basic nature, my reason for incarnation, my way of working in the world. Now what do I do? So the first task is really of beginning to integrate that, to take this very interior process and extrovert it, into a life that you're building to honor this new knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And so that often has its own tribulations, in the sense of realizing that you need to let go of other things, like maybe it's relationships, maybe it's a career shift, maybe it's something else. And some of those choices may seem kind of weird to people who knew you before.
Totally.
Like, why are you letting go of this stuff you've been building for 10 years or whatever? But the interior clarity is such that you can't just pretend that you don't have the awareness. So that's really the next work, is building a life to honor the knowledge that's come through, and then continuing to nurture the relationship to the Holy Guardian Angel, much like a marriage. I think I liken it to pre-K&C as a courtship, and then you have the marriage, and then you work on the marriage, which means you're finding ways to increasingly integrate the will of the angel into your everyday decision making, and trying to hold that consciousness, that union, as much as you can. Many Thelemic writers have touched on this, but most poignantly to me, I think, is some letters from Carl Germer to my teacher, Phil Seckler, and to Jane Wolfe, also talking about how sometimes it feels like the angels deserted you, and sometimes it's very strong and they're in your ear all the time, and sometimes it feels like it's just become integrated into your deep conscience, and so your choices and your way of working in the world just kind of are the influence of the angel. That's a long-winded answer to your basic question of what comes next, but basically you build a life around it.
Yeah, I mean, there couldn't really be anything, it couldn't be a really simple answer to that question. After reading your book, I've always considered that I've had something at least akin to this experience. I had a very, very powerful confrontational experience with a spirit guide, and ever since then, it's been something I've been integrating into my life, very, very similar. When working with Thelema, or a system of magic that's Qabalah based, what seems to be happening to me, even though I haven't done this, so this is an outsider's perspective, is that you're building this model of your own psyche, and you're using the tree of life as a way to map that model, right? And when you do that, it must change your brain a little bit, right? Because you're syncing it to this thing that already exists to map your brain, but you're really getting them aligned with each other, and there's for lack of a better word, a mythology attached to it, right? And that's a powerful way in which we interpret realities, through stories and mythology. And so, when you get to that point and you've gone through these different grades and you're ready to perform such a ritual, do you find that it manifests in mostly similar ways for Thelemites, when it might manifest a very different way for, let's say, Buddhists, or for people of a different religion, right? Because there's similar experiences described across many traditions. But I think once you map yourself to a tradition, right, you're going to have an experience that's within that tradition, because I think that's how our brains work, right? My point is, there's a part in your book when you're talking about, maybe you've had some experience with the HGA, but not the actual conversation, right? How do you discern?
Yeah, great and important questions. I think one of the answers to that is of course that every individual finds their own way, even if they're working in a very specific regimented system. It's hard for me to imagine that a person doesn't have to customize, intentionally or not, what they're doing in order to be most open to the experience and to facilitate it. We tend to end up customizing our own ritual approaches. You're the high priest of your own religion, priest or priestess, of your own religion, and prophet of the angel. No one else will worship in your church, but it's, it works for you. So it's highly customized. Certainly happens there in details, vary from tradition to tradition, obviously, but I think there are a few building blocks that have to be there. It's hard for me to imagine them not being there. And that's what I'm writing about in my, as a precursor to this Way of the Will, if someone has not read Living Thelema, in the chapter on the methods and tools of AA, which of course is Crowley's original magical order. And what I'm getting at in that chapter and in the corresponding podcast episodes is that things like having your body healthy, things like having your mind balanced, things like having an energy source, which I tend to call it Kundalini. There's an energy source that we know how to cultivate and safely contain and direct, and having devotion to the whatever our idea of the divine is. So put very simply, those building blocks, I think they got to be there somehow.
Yeah.
What system you use to find them or build them could vary immensely, and obviously does if you look in the world and the variety of traditions that result in people having attainment. The other question that was embedded, I think, in your set of questions there was differentiating the experience of the HGA from maybe some of the other experiences we have interacting with various entities, whatever we call them or however we think of them. And my best metaphor I've ever come up with is orgasm. When you've had one, you're not going to be confused that you've had one. And so thinking about the full climactic knowledge and conversation experience as an orgasm that you're not going to mistake for anything else is a pretty good way to think about it. Also, the specificity of the experience. You can have ecstatic experience all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
Entheogens, ritual, breathing practices, sex, all kinds of ways. But aligning ecstatic experience with specific influx of new awareness about your existence that is only for you.
Yeah.
And has this potential to overturn your life in a good way and set it on its right course. That doesn't just happen with every ecstatic experience.
Right.
So it's specific ecstasy, I guess.
Yeah.
That we're getting at.
I also liked that you talked about, because it's also a very familiar experience for me, receiving information that doesn't sound like it came from you.
Right.
That's been a very important part of my practice. And I've always found that when I receive that kind of information, that kind of, they call it download. Some people are familiar with that term. It's always far more poetic, more articulate than I am as a human being. It's got this quality to it that I wish I could write like that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't sound like me.
Right. And the other thing that kind of functions as a proof in a way of the validity of the information, or at least of the kind of otherness of the information, is that you could, I'll just speak for myself. I've found that all this information came through, and over the course of years, I kept trying to decode it all. And things were locking together in ways I couldn't possibly have planned. I couldn't possibly have thought of in advance and encoded that way. What's that about? If it was just in my head somewhere, then it was so deeply unconscious that I couldn't possibly have had access to it before. But that's not the way it feels. It feels like it was handed to me because someone who handed it to me was smarter, than I am.
As you're talking about this, the HGA and the conversation and getting this new direction for your life. Now, once again, I've just been really on this cult kick lately, like looking at these people who start cults and what they're doing. And I feel like some of these people are channeling something, but it's not that higher self that's directing them to do great things, because I also see these people are dishonest. I see that they are, they're scamming people out of money, but there does seem to be a quality of a kind of trance channel happening there. What do you think that's about?
I think it's about people accessing higher energies and bringing them into an imbalanced human personality. Often people are blind to their own ego strivings, power drives, need for love or need for adulation or something like that isn't weeded out and worked on first.
Right.
And then they plug into 220 socket and it activates everything and makes the shitty parts bigger, and makes the parts that are good bigger, and I think that's the danger. And that's the advantage of having a system that includes some self-awareness tools and psychological balancing tools, so that when the current gets turned way up, it comes into a balanced system. The image I often use for that is like a cup or a grail has got to not have holes in it, or else when the light comes in or the liquid comes in, it doesn't hold it, or it's got to be balanced so it doesn't topple. And thinking about the ego personality as that cup that needs to be balanced and complete.
That makes so much sense. Some of these people, for example, they're very charismatic. I mean, cult leaders, they always have a few particular qualities to them. One is charisma, and another is a they have to be presenting something to people that they're in awe of. And so I think that they have some of that energy, like you were saying, but it's coming into that unbalanced personality. That makes perfect sense. And they haven't done the self-work, which is funny because that's often what they're selling, is a method of self-work, right? But they haven't done it themselves, and so it's going through this big ego, and wow. Yeah.
And paradoxically, of course, they tend to be the healthiest person in the world, right? That I figured it out, I got it all settled, but you don't, so pay me and I'll help you.
Yeah.
But there's great irony there.
Yeah, and there is, and that's one of the things that, to me, that's one of the very first red flags there is anybody who's like a self-proclaimed guru, or something that makes them better or special and above everyone else, but I think that's a whole bunch of hooey. I think that there are people who have done the work and achieved a certain level of gnosis or attainment, like you're saying, and then want to help others achieve it in a really healthy way. And then there's people who are like, just give me all of your money. Just give me all your money, and I'll fix all your problems for you, or some such nonsense. Yeah. So
in some ways it comes back around to the idea of the guru being the intercessory, the intermediary between the divine and you, the person who wants to feel better. God only talks to me, so you better do what I say.
Then they become the embodiment, or often, the one episode of the podcast I did was with a survivor of the cult of Nithyananda, and he of course claims to be the reincarnation of Shiva living on Earth, and that those kinds of incredible claims always are just tremendous red flags.
Yeah. I'm sure that's totally accurate.
Yeah. So, on this path that you've been on for how many years now? More than 20, 30 years?
31.
31 years.
30, yeah.
And do you find in that time, I mean, I think the answer clearly is yes with your books, right? But you find that even in that time that the Tree of Life, as you say in the book, it contains everything. I'm paraphrasing, right? But you say it's a map that contains every possible scenario, essentially, and you still find that to be true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not claiming it's the only model that can do that, but you got to pick a system. You don't have to, but I've found it extremely useful to have picked a system 31 years ago and worked it consistently and developed an internally consistent path and set of symbols and so on. So yes, I have found, partially, of course, because I've constructed it this way for myself, that the Tree of Life is a model that can encompass all the possibilities in the universe and all the possibilities in the human psyche and all the possibilities about the interplay between those two things, which is why it's such a useful model of attainment, I think.
And, so it's just one of these things where I've never really gotten around to it, is to studying the Tree of Life personally, but I'm, tarot is where my practice begins and ends. At the beginning of the end of the day, I am a tarot reader first and foremost. And I understand that part of the formation of the Golden Dawn was understanding the correlation between the major arcana, at least, and the Tree of Life, right? Now, does that also apply to the minor arcana?
Yeah, it all maps out. Yeah. For example, let's say the first top sphere on the Tree of Life, Kether, that's all of the aces or the ones in the deck. And the third sphere, Binah, is all of the threes and so on. And then all the trumps are the connecting
points.
Paths. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay. Very, very cool. And it's interesting because when I read that in your book, I'm like, that's great, because that's literally what I tell people about tarot. Like, whenever I'm teaching tarot, I say that this deck of cards contains every possible situation, personality, archetype, astrology. It's all smushed into this deck of cards, and then one of the beautiful things about tarot for me is that every deck is the same but different. You get the same cards, but a different perspective or a different take on the cards, which I really, really love. Now, speaking of astrology, that's something I really wanted to kind of pick your brain about. Now, in Thelema, astrology is a part of the practice. Is that correct?
Yes, it doesn't have to be for anyone. Like many of these tools, useful tools, but there's few things that I would say are absolutely necessary, but many people do explore astrology in the Thelemic context, and it's used probably pretty similarly to the way it is used in other contexts. Also, of course, maps out on the tree of life in terms of correspondences of planets and zodiacal signs and elements and so on. So it becomes another tool for self-understanding and for those who use it in such a way for divination, prediction.
Now, I've never been interested really in predictive astrology. In fact, I don't really do predictive tarot either. I think that, within my magical paradigm, we have many possible futures, and I could tell you about one of them, but nothing's predetermined. So I avoid that. I think that tarot is a great tool for examining this exact moment, right? And what's going on with you internally right now. Same with astrology. It gives you sort of a blueprint of your psyche, at least natal astrology. And I practice whole sign, classical planet, natal astrology. To me, that's my jam. That's what I think is the best. Not to knock any of the other systems. There's just, you got to kind of pick one. There's so many. Back in the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned the conscious and the superconscious and the ego, right? And that's very similar to Freud's, right? The id, the ego, and then what was the third one? The superconscious or the superego?
Superego.
Yeah, right. Superego. So looking at those, I've always seen those, and I'm like, yes, sun, moon, rising. That's what I see when I look at that concept, right? So I'm just explaining how I arrived at this next question for you, really, which is, does the HGA manifest somewhere in a person's astrological chart? Are there clues? Are there hints? Or is it correspond to a particular planet or a sign? Or what's your take on that?
I have not detected so far any patterns there that would suggest that there's some specific linkage that one could look for or use as almost as a predictive element of where should I hunt for the angel. But I think it's highly likely, to put it another way, that once one has had knowledge and conversation, one will find that the understanding of oneself that you've gotten from the work in astrology is going to be like really fleshed out, expanded upon, made sense of by what you've learned from the angel. That it sort of explains all we've ever been in a new way that makes a lot of sense, but we couldn't have arrived at before. So that's my basic answer to that.
So one of the ways in which I heard you describe the HCA in the book is as the embodiment of your true will. So your true will and your holy guardian angel are two halves of a coin. Is that essentially?
There's various sort of quasi-poetic ways to think about it that I think are helpful. What I'll often say is that the true will is the voice of the angel,
right?
And what I mean by that, and others have said this too, it's not just my idea, but that the idea is that since the angel is an essential linkage between the human consciousness and the highest divine consciousness, since the angel is fully in touch with the universal will and its particularized expression in the individual, when we have knowledge and conversation, it's like, even though the angel's been whispering in our ear our whole lives, we've finally gotten into a place where we can keep our head in the right place to hear it consistently.
Right.
And therefore, that information that comes through about our purpose on earth, we can act on it more readily because we're more open to it, and it's just more accessible.
Okay, very cool. And you mentioned in the book also, when you are on the beginning of this path, you have maybe a wider sort of look at where you're going and what you're doing in life. And as you come into alignment with your true will, the path gets narrower and narrower as you focus in on it, right? So I've always kind of described this a little bit differently. To me, it's always seemed like when you come into alignment with what you're supposed to be doing here in this world, the universe gives you a tailwind, right? And otherwise it might give you a lot of speed bumps. So I'm always thinking, if I'm experiencing a lot of speed bumps in life, maybe I'm not doing what's in alignment for me. And if I'm feeling a lot of success and I'm moving in a direction that the universe seems to approve of, then maybe I am moving more towards my true will. But how does a person go about discerning their true will prior to the knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel?
The whole process of aspiring to the Holy Guardian Angel and working on oneself in preparation for that includes stripping away barriers to self-awareness, okay? Deepening our understanding of our strengths and weaknesses, balancing those, tuning into what naturally makes us feel alive and joyous and on target. And those flow moments in life, as it's sometimes called, where we can just tell that we're doing exactly the right thing at that moment. Maybe for me, like, it was the first time I taught a class on dream analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, before I was even into occultism of any kind. And it was just so like, this is what I want to do. I'm fully alive right now. If we look back at our lives for those kinds of moments, we get important clues about true will. So, and this is kind of an intellectual way of coming at it, maybe kind of an intuitive way as well. So that's not the same as the sort of cataclysmic download, as you put it, that happens with KNC, but there are clues all along, and there's some useful resources out there that, like, just popular books on this. The Soul's Code by James Hillman is one that came out a while ago. I recommend a lot. Let Your Life Speak by Parker J. Palmer is another great little book on this. The clues are always there, and they can, we can do a lot with those, even if we're not on a magical path at all, or even, certainly prior to KNC.
Yeah. And I think that that's so important, because I think that a lot of people who are maybe looking more in the self-help direction and not so much into the esoteric, that's got to be difficult, right, to discern your true will. I mean, maybe for some people it comes completely naturally, just through synchronicity, and they just find their thing, and they're going along. But I know that a lot of people struggle to find meaning, and they've struggled to find, what am I supposed to be doing? So I guess
Sure.
Is your true will what you're supposed to be doing, or is it what you is it like, hey, are you being told you're supposed to do this, or are you discovering what you decided to do?
Okay, so important layers there. Crowley's solution to the free will versus determinism question essentially breaks down into, I was just talking about this last weekend, breaks down into what plane are we looking at. So on the plane of the human personality, we're making choices. That's our experience. We're making choices. So we have this free will. You can call it illusory or not. On the plane of the divine, since we're all God, on that level, it was us that decided what we were going to do.
Right.
So either way, it's like free will and determinism coexisting, and both existing in us. It just depends on which part of us we're looking at. The true will is, I often call it the basic nature, also, to clarify that what we're talking about is a unique way that we are. The true will is not a single task to do, or it's not true job, it's true will, meaning we're here to be a certain way. And when we can figure out with specificity what that is, and then go do that, and then go be that in the world, that will be our best possible contribution to the evolution of humanity. It's inherently service oriented to discover who we are, and then remove obstacles to that, and then go do it.
Yes. I'm a huge believer that the best thing you could ever do for everyone else is to become the best possible version of yourself.
Exactly.
That is truly the best thing you could do for the rest of the world. Okay, I have one very loaded question for you. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Is it, in your opinion, and this is I want to preface this and say that this question is going to be difficult to answer. Okay. Thought experiment here. Do you think it is possible that there have been people throughout history who have been in alignment with their true will, but that true will was something terrible? Or are there monsters throughout history? Was Genghis Khan following his true will? Essentially is what I'm asking. Is it possible?
Yeah, and what I could speak to, I'd say, is the possibility. Obviously, I don't have the ability to, no one does, to say, well, yes, that was their true will.
Yeah.
But first of all, there's lots of people's true wills we won't like in some way. There's no question that some people have true wills that others won't like. Someone's true will might be to be that person who complains about everything and points out the problems, because they're a problem solver, and their way of being is to go through life and say, this could be better, that could be better. That's really pretty annoying to those around them sometimes,
For sure.
That person might be very critical or whatever. So this is just a small example, non-horrific example of somebody having a true will that isn't likable by others. You mentioned it's storming where you are. Well, the storm is perfectly happy to be doing what it's doing. It's not evil. It's doing what storms do. But from the perspective of the people it's raining on, it's pretty annoying. And for the person who gets struck by lightning, it's really annoying. So I think there are sometimes people whose true will is a pretty harmful and dislikable and even abhorrent at the human personality level. It's easy to look and say, look at the bloodshed, or look how mean they were, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And to judge that. And that's our right. That's what we should be doing. As society has the right to try to protect itself from evil on the level of, the evil that humans can do, removing rights from people, harming people. But we can't speak to the universal purpose behind all of that.
Right.
We don't have access to that. This can veer dangerously close to God works in mysterious ways, and
Yeah.
But I don't know how else to understand it. If we're walking in the park on a beautiful day, it's the happiest day of our lives with our loved one. It's ecstasy. It's great. But every ant we step on, it's the apocalypse. And if we were to say that destruction of that life somehow makes our walk in the park evil, then we're in a trap we can't get out of existentially or philosophically. So I think, that's quite an answer. I don't know if it's a helpful answer, but
I think it's a very helpful answer. And like I said, this is just something I tend to think about. Trying to be a balanced person within in a spiritual sense is very, very important to me. And one of the things that I see that I don't like, now I'm going to be that complaining person for a moment, is that I see in some spiritual circles, on the internet, this denial of anything that isn't love and light. I think everyone's seen this, and there's something about it that's very off-putting, and I'm like, you're ignoring a tremendous part of reality. I also really firmly believe that the world cannot function without opposing viewpoints, and that unfortunately, in today's world, we seem to be going apart from each other, when really I always feel like diametrically opposing forces are always pointing towards the middle, when maybe that's where we should be aimed as a society. I don't know. But it's one of the things that I received from, let's just say a spirit guide at this point, was that while there are people who are on a path of raising consciousness, of knowing themselves and of attaining true will, there are also people on an opposite path, and that will always be true. And so I was curious kind of on your take on that.
Yeah. I think that the main thing I would want to add to that is that I think most of the time, and this I think is evident if we think about our day-to-day lives, most of the time conflicts arise from a lack of self-awareness in at least one of the parties involved.
Yeah.
If I'm not aware of some sort of mean streak in myself, and I go and I get in a conflict at work with somebody, that's not two true wills battling each other. That's me getting out of alignment with truth, and just blindly being a jerk,
Yeah.
So I think much of the time, the conflicts we see in big and little ways are a failure for a person, or a society, or all of humanity to kind of self-actualize enough to realize their blind spots and find a better way to deal with it.
Yeah.
So I would just add that.
Yeah, I think that's really, really great advice. Really great way to look at it, because this is why know thyself, or some version of that is so prevalent in so many practices, because it's really what it's all about. And to know yourself, I believe, is to know reality, and that the two, I don't believe that you end at your skin. I think that we're all connected, and you can talk about this in terms of quantum entanglement, or just or philosophically, but I think we're all part of the one thing, which is the universe. Unless there's a multiverse, let's not get into that. But you know what I mean? What we could call the all.
We'll settle that in the next interview.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, that's all the time we've got, David. Thank you so much for being here. I really love our conversations, and I really love your books. And you're one of the only Thelemites I can talk to, and it's like I get what you're saying, and it really seems so very applicable for people even outside of Thelema.
Well, it's been a delight to talk to you again. Always had a great time last time and was looking forward to this as well. And if I may, before I depart, let me just drop a few upcoming events and,
Yeah, let's
and
do
things
it.
that people might want to know about.
And these will be in the description for those of you listening or watching. Go ahead.
Fantastic. So event-wise, we're about to present our 4th iteration of ThelemaCon, which is open to the public, is a conference that is going to be both in person and online, happening October 4, 5, 6 here in Raleigh, North Carolina for those in person. If you go to thelemacon.org, you can see the presenters, and the schedule includes myself, Lon Milo DeQuette, Richard Kaczynski, and others who I hold in high esteem, and we always have a good time. If you are interested in learning more about my other writings or my podcast, go to livingthelema.com or see the YouTube channel. And if you are interested in the training options along these lines in the Thelemic current, including the Temple of the Silver Star, which is sort of a Golden Dawn patterned Thelemic order, that's at totss.org. And then, as I said, Crowley's original magical organization, the AA, you can reach at onestarinsight.org. And so
that's the original organization that's still going.
Yes, it's over the past 100 plus years, there are various groups out there that claim to be AA, and the one I can just personally vouch for and work with directly is at onestarinsight.org.
Okay, awesome. Well, like I said, all of those links will be in the description. And David, thanks again for being here. I will see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.